This conference will now be recorded.
So today I will do pre-installation planning. So from now onwards, we will go for installation. So before going to install the Linux software and then grid software, then database software, and then database creation. So before going to that, I will tell you about what are the things required for pre-installation. So the first thing is that we need to plan the few things. So in that, the first thing is shared storage planning for grid infrastructure and RAC, because storage is the first thing. So Oracle Clusterware configuration files like voting disk and OCR can be stored on a supported clusterware file system or ASM or NFS or a certified NAS filler. So direct NFS client does not support Oracle clusterware files. So please remember that. And in conjunction with ASM cluster file system, ASM basically provide a complete shared storage solution for Oracle grid infrastructure and RAC. So if you see the table in the slide, raw or block devices are not directly supported. So you can see that ASM support OCR and voting disk, grid home no, rack home no, rack database file yes, Oracle uh, recovery files yes, and ACFS only support that rack home, rack database file, and Oracle recovery files, but it present 1, 2, 3, 4. So what is that meaning? It is mentioned below the table. And then NFS, then raw device, then local file system. So if you want to upgrade an existing Oracle RAC database or an Oracle RAC database with ASM instances, you can use existing raw or block device partition and perform a rolling upgrade of your existing installation. So on that time you can do that, but for fresh installation, it will not support it. So this is general storage planning for grid and rack. So basically we use in this training ASM storage option, which is the best option for grid infrastructure and rack databases. If you go with a shared file system with grid infrastructure, so for that, Oracle Clusterware, Oracle ASM, Oracle RAC, and the file system must comply with the following requirement. So if you want to use an NFS file system, it must be on supported NAS device. So if you want to see the certification, so you need to log in to my Oracle support and click certifications to find the most current information about supported NAS device. So link is there, support.oracle.com. If you choose to place your OCR files on a shared file system, Oracle recommend that you can configure a shared file system in one of the following ways. The first one is that you can go with OS operating system utility like RED. Okay, and at least two file systems are mounted and use the feature of Oracle Clusterware, which basically comes in 12.1 to provide redundancy for the OCR. So in the slide, you can see that if suppose you want to place your database files on a shared file system, then you can go for disk use for the file system or are on a highly storage device like RAID devices. And the file system consists at least two independent file system with the database files on the file system and recovery files on a different file system. So these are the some information. and also user account with which you perform the installation. Either you can go for grid or Oracle, but my suggestion is go for grid infrastructure, and go for Oracle for RAC database, so that you can easily understand what are the options required for grid user, what are the options required for Oracle user. But you have facility, you can go anyone. And also Oracle recommend that you create a grid infrastructure management repository. This is an optional component, but if you do not select this feature during installation, you lose access to Oracle database quality of service management, memory card, and cluster health monitor. So you cannot enable this feature after installation except by reinstalling the grid infrastructure. So this is important interview question regarding cluster health monitor, which is very good option to monitor the cluster. Now come to a sizing storage for Oracle Clusterware. So these are the sizes which is required. So to store all Oracle cluster files on the shared file system with external redundancy, we had normal and high and external. We did that in ASM. I hope you remember that. So you will need a minimum 300 MB for each voting disk volume, and you will also need a minimum 400 MB on each OCR volume. And if a management repository reside in the same volume, the OCR volume storing the repository should be a minimum of 3.6 GB plus 500 MB for each node for cluster greater than 4 node. For example, suppose you have 6 node cluster, allocation should be 4.6 GB. So these are the information regarding the sizes, minimum requirement. But when you had external redundancy, right? And suppose if you have normal redundancy, then on that time to store all clusterware file system, so you should have at least 2 into 4 GB of storage available, minimum 3 volume. So 3 separate volume location for the OCR and 2 OCR mirror and 1 voting disk on each volume. So you should have minimum of 3 physical disks to ensure that voting disk and OCR file on separate physical disk. And if you want to add another 5 or 10 MB for each node for cluster greater than 5 nodes. So these are the things. And in the table, you can see that at least 400 MB for each OVR volume, totaling 800 MB, at least 300 MB for each voting disk. So voting disk should be 3 because we have 3 disks, so totaling 900 MB. So like that you can size about the files which you have, so OCR, voting disk, and all. Now logical volume managers and grid infrastructure. So Oracle Grid Infrastructure and Oracle RAC only support Clusterware Volume Manager. If you are using third-party volume managers are not cluster aware and so are not supported. So to confirm that a volume manager you want to use is supported, click certification again to support.oracle.com, and you can check which volume manager is certified for RAC. So you can check that, and after that you can use it. Okay. Now managing voting disk in ASM. So as we know that for external redundancy, we required 1 voting disk. For normal redundancy, we required 3 voting disks. And for high redundancy, we required 5 voting disks. So Oracle Clusterware uses voting disk files, also called as voting disk, to determine which nodes are a member of cluster and to maintain the integrity of the cluster. If you configure voting disk on ASM, you do not need to manually configure the voting disk. Please remember this line. And depending on the redundancy of the specified disk group, a predefined number of voting disks are created. ASM manage voting disk differently from other files that it stores. So when you initially configure Oracle Clusterware, you specify the disk group to contain the voting disk. Each voting disk is housed in a separate ASM failure group. Okay, so a separate failure group is required for each voting disk. Okay, so you must specify enough failure group to support the number of voting disks associated with each disk group redundancy setting. Suppose you have at least 3 failure group to store your voting disk in a normal redundancy disk group. So voting disks do not appear as regular file within ASM. Rather than clusterware records exactly where the disk voting disk information is located. See, this type of things exist so that if ASM is unavailable for any reason, cluster synchronization service can still access the voting disk and maintain the cluster. So from where it will get the information if ASM disk is not available? Question. Tell me, guys. Did you get my question?
Can you repeat the question, Ahmad?
If ASM disk is not mount, if ASM instance is not mounted, or if ASM is not available, so from where you will find out the voting disk information? Because without voting disk, your clusterware will not started. Yes, Shan had done answer correctly. So OLR, that's why OLR came into the picture when these types of problem occurs. So OLR is basically local repository which reside on each node. So if suppose your ASM is down, excuse me, so it can get the information from there. Okay. So one of the benefit of using an ASM disk group with either normal or high redundancy, the benefit is that if this containing a voting disk fails, as long as there is another disk available in the disk group, is ASM will automatically recover the voting disk. So this is important point. So voting disks are managed by CRSCTL utility. I hope you know that. So suppose you are migrating voting disk from their current location to ASM disk group name vote. So what you will do? You will fire CRSCTL replace vote disk plus vote. So that is the command. Okay. So this is pre-installation planning for your RAC or grid infrastructure or RAC database, right? Now, what pre-installation task you will do that before going to start installation? So these are the few things like check your system requirement, check your network requirement, installed required operating system packages, set kernel parameter, create group and user, create required directories, and configure installation over shell limit. Shell limit is set in limits.conf file. I hope you know that. And install grid infrastructure. So to successfully install grid infrastructure, it is important that you have an understanding of the task that must be completed and order in which they must occur. So before the installation, you need to know these things so you can perform easily the grid infrastructure task. So Oracle grid infrastructure must be installed by using GUI graphical Oracle user interface. So this is character-based tool. Character-based tool installation are not possible, but OUI can be run in silent mode, either using response file to supply the values that install the things which you need, which you want, and ensure that your cluster hardware is functionally supported. before you begin the setup. So if you intend to use Enterprise Manager Cloud Control to manage your cluster deployment, you must next install for EM agent on each cluster node. Okay, so that is different thing. I am not going into that. So general server minimum requirement. So these are the requirement which you follow. So you can see that 30-bit and 64-bit Oracle software version in the same cluster stack is not supported. Make sure that servers are started with run level 3 or 4, and at least you had display resolution of 1024 into 768, and ensures that server runs the same operating system binary for each node. Okay, because every node has on a different server. So maybe you can think that on one node you can install Red Hat 5, on one node you can install Red Hat 6. So like that you can do that, but that is not recommended. Okay, and don't ask me whether it will work or not, because hypothetical questions I never answered. If you have any query, just do it and then see that. Okay. Yes. Any questions till now regarding this? Okay. Now, if you want to check system requirement, so the minimum requirement RAM is 4 GB for a grid infrastructure. I don't think so that is correct, because that value they have given according to their server. So their server is very powerful. But if suppose you are installing on laptop, 4 GB is very insufficient. It will take too much time, but you can try with 4 GB. Okay, and swap space you can set with 4 to 16 GB. And how to get the information of RAM, you had a command free -m or dash m, I don't know what is the correct thing. And the minimum required swap space 4 to 16 GB. If your RAM should be 16 GB, then you need to set swap 16 GB more than. Okay, and at least 1 GB of disk space is available in the temp directory, and at least 8 GB is required on each node for the grid infrastructure software home to store that. At least 12 GB additional space in the Oracle based directory for grid infrastructure. And if you are installing trace file analyzer character, then collector, then it is required. And if you intend to install Oracle database or RAC database on the cluster, be aware the size of the shared memory area, that is dev/dev/shm on each server, and it should be greater than SGA and the PGA of the database on the server. If suppose it is not there, it will not work. Okay, because you don't have to increase DS dev SHM after database are installed on the cluster. And with the introduction of Oracle Database 12c, 32-bit system are no longer supported. So you have only option for 64. So that is the only one option which you can use. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and enabling the name service cache daemon. So to allow Clusterware better network failure when using NAS and NFS, then on that time this service should be started, and that is nscd. So you can do by sbin service command by ncsd nscd start. And if you want to check whether this service is load on system startup, then you need to configure by chk config command. I hope you know that. So when you fire a list of nscd, it will tell you about 0 1 2 3 4 5 6. So these are the run levels basically. So if you see run level 3, it is on, and run level file it is off. So that is not correct. So it should be on both the level. So by what command you can do that? Chk config high dash dash level 35 nscd is on. Clear? But that is required when you are using nas and nfs. So we are using asm, so that is not important for us. Now setting the disk IO scheduler on Linux. So that is IO related things. So that need to be carefully handled when you are installing the database grid infrastructure software, and after that your database software installation, and then your database creation. So for IO, Linux has multiple disk IO scheduler available. So these are the values which is mentioned: deadline, no, anticipatory, completely fair. So these are Linux related concept. So if you want to go into more in detail, so you need to consider Red Hat documentation. So from there you can get the more information regarding this IO scheduler which are available. And for ASM, Oracle recommend that you should use deadline IO scheduler. Important point. So basically, disk IO scheduler reorder, delay, or merge request for disk IO to achieve better throughput and lower latency. So as I said, Linux has multiple disk IO scheduler available, and from where you can check that deadline disk IO is configured. So if you see that below the PPT, echo deadline greater than sysblog asm disk queue scheduler. So to make the IO scheduler selection across system reboot, so you should need to append elevator statement in grub.configuration file. So it will be reside in boot folder. In that you have grug folder. In that you will get grub grub.conf file. So in that you will mention elevator equals to deadline. Okay, so this is the way you can do that. Now scan I already covered. So the cluster name for scan, how many characters you can use maximum? Tell me. Yeah, Sunil is correct. 15 character. Okay. And if you enter a domain with a scan name and want to use GNS with the zone delegation, then domain must be the GNS domain, and scan must be globally unique. And after installation, you can change the cluster name or not. Tell me. Yes, we can change, but you need to reinstall Oracle Grid infrastructure. Okay. Now checking network requirement. So as I said, at least we require two NICs. One is for private, one is for public. public NIC support TCP/IP, and private NIC support only UDP for Linux related system, and for Windows it can. Okay, and IP addresses, I already told you there are two ways by that you can configure. One is GNS, in that you use one static address, and second method is DNS, in that you will define static addresses which your network admin will give you. And public IP must be configured either in DNS or ETS host file. But for client, it should be used DNS, not host file. But in our practice, I will show you in host file. Okay. So if the time stamp no, among the nodes differs significantly, so node eviction and reboots can occur or not? Tell me. It will occur. So if you are using GNS, then IP addresses is required. So if GNS is used, then GNS VIP address is defined in the DNS domain before installation, and DNS must be configured to support the GNS. And before installation, DNS administrator must establish this, and DNS lookup to direct the DNS resolution. And DHCP server on the public network is required, that basically allocate or allow the dynamically allocate VIP addresses for your cluster. Okay, so that is GNS. And IP addresses for static configuration that we will do. So in that you required public IP, virtual IP, private IP, and scan IP. So you required four types of IPs, and in that public, virtual, and scan on the same subnet, and private will be on different subnet. I hope you know that. Actually, why I am telling this, because in installation, when I will do that, then on that time you can easily understand. So that's why I'm doing this. And a broadcast and multicast requirement. So as we know that broadcast communication use ARP and UDP protocol, which is basically used for public and private interfaces. And in that MDNS Daemon, we did that in the last session. So that basically uses multicasting on all interfaces to communicate with other node in the cluster. And from 11.202 GI and later releases, multicasting is required for private interconnect. So that is a very important point. Please remember that this line. Okay. And one of the IP addresses subnet range start from 224 to 0.020/24, and second is 230 to 0.1.0/24. So these are the classless interdomain routing actually. So that is called as CIDR. Now, private interconnect network requirement. So as we know that private interconnect is used to communicate between the node, and each cluster node member must have interface, and these subnet must connect to every node of the cluster. And for private network, the endpoint of all interconnect interfaces must be completely reachable on the network. So suppose if the private interface have a subnet mask like 255.255.255.0, then your private network is in the range is 192.168.0.0 hyphen 192.168.0.255. Okay, and your private addresses must be in the range of the last digit, that is 0 to 25 or 255. So if the private network interface has a range of 255.255.0.0, so your private address range will be 192.168, then 0-255 and 0-255. So this is the way your IPs you can give that. Okay. For interconnect NIC guidelines, actually, so they said that configure the network on the fastest PCI bus, ensure that nickname and slot are identical, and define flow control so that you need to receive equals to on and transmit equals to off, and define full bit rate supported by NIC, define full duplex auto negotiate. So these are basically related with network admin, but you need to know that so that you can communicate when they are setting these things in big companies. Okay. And ensure compatibility switch. So these are the two things. Maximum transmission unit MTU should be the same between the NIC and switch. And if suppose you are using 802.3 AD is used on NIC, it must be used and support on the switch, and driver setting can change between software releases. Okay. So suppose if these are misconfigured, so what will happen? Your drop packets and fragments, your buffer overflows, your packet reassembly failures or timeout, and general errors you will get it if this interconnect is wrongly configured. Because network plays an important role, so that's why they had more slide on network related, and that is private interconnect is basically. So if you use IPv4 for interconnect or private, then when you define multiple interfaces, so Clusterware creates from 1 to 4 IP highly available addresses, and the installer enable redundant interconnect usage to provide high availability private network, and grid infrastructure uses all of the highly available interconnect, basically private network. And if a private interconnect interface fails, then Clusterware transparently move the HAIP address to one of the remaining functional interfaces. So if you see the diagram where you can see that there is two network card, ETH1 and ETH2. So sometime you will get ETH0 and ETH1, and sometime you will get ETH1 and ETH2. Every node has this, and this is interconnect. So they had ETH2, ETH1, and here ETH2, ETH1. So link aggregation can be used to increase redundancy or higher availability with active standby configuration. So if you see that ETH1 is active and ETH2 is the standby for your node. So when you fire the if config command, so in that you will get the keyword master. So that is very important. Okay. Because we know that if you have two nodes, so one will be the master and another will be the slave. So if your one is master, so it will show you master. If one is ETH is slave, it will show you slave. So ETH1 and ETH2 basically physical interface card, and the bond 0 is the device which is a virtual network interface card, and logical bond 0 interface is behave as a master, and other two interfaces are listed as a slave. Okay. So here see that redundant switch connected with inter switch trunk, and so that provide higher availability because my ETH2 is standby, my ETH1 is primary or active. So that will provide better high available design for your rack. And VLAN, basically virtual LAN, is supported in shared switch environment uh, for the interconnect. Okay. Another interconnect guidelines for UDP, because UDP is used for private for Linux and Unix operating system. So you need to set MTU size, and netstat command will give you any error. If config command will tell you about the overall picture of your network. And we had a jumbo frame, which basically are not a requirement for Oracle Clusterware, so I am ignoring that. For Oracle Clusterware, the maximum transmission unit should be what? Tell me. Another question. MTU. So these are the network problems occur when on that time you need to check that. So what is MTU to be set on all the node? It should be same or it should be different value. What? Answer me, please. If you know that, then it tell me. If you don't know, then I will tell you. So I hope nobody is responding. So MTU is basically should be same on all node. Remember, and if you don't set same value, then you will get error message in your clusterware alert log. So MTU is very important feature in that. Now cluster time synchronization, that I have covered, so I'm not going into detail. You can read the slide and then I will go for next slide. We had operating system utility, that is NTP. We have clusterware utility, that is CTSS. If CTSS is there, then that will be work. If NTP is used, then it will start as a CTSS will be go in observer mode, and your NTP will work as a front end. Okay. Now these are the software kernel requirements, which is for Oracle Enterprise Linux, Red Hat Linux, and SUSE Linux. And we had some packages requirement for 5 version, and these are for package requirement for 6 version. These are the package requirement for 7. Okay. So recently 8 is introduced, so that is not in the picture or PPTs, only up to 7. And these are SUSE Linux Enterprise Managers packages which you need to install. And this is Oracle Linux and Unbreakable Enterprise kernel. So nothing to tell in that. You can check on oracle.com US technologies/Linux. From there, you can get the information. And Oracle Please Store RPM, that is very important. We know that we have 12C R1 pre-installation RPM. Basically, it is used for configuration task. So when it is installed, automatically download and install any additional RPM needed for grid infrastructure and RAC. So that is better for DBA. And you creates Oracle user and creates the Aura inventory and OSDBA groups. Then you need to set sysctl.conf setting for parameter and driver parameters, and sets hard and soft resource limit. And for 5.2 and higher version, this is included in installation media. Before that, it was not there. Okay. And also there is one important RPM which we need to install, that is cvuqdisk. So this is for cluster verification utility. If this is not there, then your cluster verification utility will not work. So for that, you need to export this environment variable, that is cvuqdisk underscore grp equals to o install. And then after that, you install this RPM from the directory where it was saved. So RPM installed by the command rpm-iv and the RPM name. Okay, so we look into installation. Then this is zero downtime kernel update with Ksplice. Okay, so that is basically which is a part of Oracle Linux, and it updates the Linux operating system kernel when it is running. So without requiring restarts or any interruption, Ksplice is available only with Oracle Linux. So you can use if you have premium support subscription and an access key. Okay, so that we will not see that. Now, this is many times we did that, how to create a group, how to create user. So that we will see practical. So I'm not talking about that. And this is the command to create groups, create user, create directories. So I hope everyone knows that, but don't worry, I will cover that. Then these are the limits which you need to set in limits.conf file. So basically for a grid user, you need to set soft and hard limit. And for Oracle user, you also need to save these values. So in installation, we will go into that. And with Oracle 12c, you can run a script manually as root, and also in installation, you can choose run that script automatically. So that you will get from 12c. Earlier, it was not there. Okay. So thank you. This is the pre-installation planning and pre-installation task for grid infrastructure installation. I hope you get some idea if this is new for you. If you already know that, then that will be the revision for you. If you have any questions, let me know.